Welcome back to If I Knew You Better. I'm Brendan Davis, your host, and my guest today is Stephen J. KATZ, who I will be calling Steve from this point forward. Steve has possibly the most eclectic resume of anyone I've ever spoken to. And yes, that sounds like hyperbole, and no, I am not kidding. This is pretty wild. When I did the edit on this interview and made notes about all the different things, I thought, well, I could mention this, I can mention that. This is a summary. This is a short, not comprehensive summary, but it gives you an idea of the span, the breadth, and the depth of his background, which is pretty amazing. So his influences as an artistic person started back in the 1960s. He grew up with Ray Harryhausen and Famous Monsters magazine, but growing up in Westport, Connecticut, he was around the world of artistic and literary folks such as Paul Newman, Joanne Woodward, and the Westport County Playhouse. And he started sneaking in and then actually was able just to walk right in and watch rehearsals with visiting directors from New York, like Woody Allen, for instance. And all these influences growing up like this, and he had very supportive parents, that brought him into this artistic life from the very beginning. He had a cousin in New York and learned film cameras and specifically the process known as rear projection, which he talks about in the episode with me, in New York City, working on TV shows like Car 54, Where Are You?, which is kind of a classic. He moved from that into putting together psychedelic light shows in New York at places like the Fillmore East. And over the next few years, he worked with bands like The Grateful Dead, The Doors, The Byrds, Sly and the Family Stone. Starting all this at age 19, he became a bluegrass banjo player and was quite good and actually thought about being professional until he realized that there were probably two people in the world who made their living as a professional bluegrass banjo player at a level where you would support yourself like he wanted to. But through a series of circumstances, he befriended a young John McTiernan, the legendary director of Die Hard, etc., and worked on his first film. He met and became friends with writing legend Michael O'Donoghue, who was not quite a legend at that time, but he was one of the originators of the show Saturday Night Live, the man who uttered the very first line as a writer, performer, occasional performer on SNL. And Steve caught his first really giant break with seeing this short film he put together that's kind of famous called The Clams. It's a spoof on The Birds from Hitchcock. This opened a season of Saturday Night Live. So this gave him a big break as a TV writer, got him represented with, agent and manager and such. And then he continued to work and grow. And he eventually established himself as a writer, director, producer in Hollywood and working all over. Among his highlights in his career, he created the first digital pre-visualization system for the feature film Clear and Present Danger, the original Jack Ryan film that starred Harrison Ford. And all that experience eventually brought him to, yes, China, where he's been involved in many projects big and small. I am cross-posting this on Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom because, yet again, accidentally, my LA-based guest has a big China connection, but we'll get into that in this show. But of all the references that I just kind of name-checked, the one that really cemented Steve's name in the back of my mind way back in the day was that he wrote what has become an absolute standard reference cinema book called Film Directing Shot by Shot. Now, it was published by the then upstart Michael Wiese Productions, and I've been fortunate to meet Michael before. And this book was released in 1992, back when I was in film school, and it instantly became required reading in all my film production courses. We Xeroxed it. I told him we probably owe him some royalties technically, but we went on to have it be required reading, so we bought a lot of copies, and I've given it to a lot of people who've asked me for recommendations, like young filmmakers or students or people whose kids are curious. So it has this familiar blue cover, and that was updated a few years ago to announce their new 25th anniversary edition, and that was freshly and thoroughly revised for the digital age. So it was a real treat for me to get to hear Steve's stories about putting that together in depth. Now, among the other crazy but true tales that I've already mentioned, we scratched the surface on Steve's several engagements as the personal filmmaking tutor for Michael Jackson. Yes, that Michael Jackson. And as he explained, this is a story he has never told before. Steve was resident at the Neverland Ranch for months at a time. I believe 5 months was the first engagement. And he was flown into luxury hotels to work with Michael. Sometimes they would just sit up late at night watching movies in Michael's suite. And he also saw some things in his time around Michael that will merit another show entirely someday. And I'm not trying to be too salacious. When we get to that portion of the interview, Steve has, mixed feelings about what he witnessed, but we will have a lot more about that topic another day. We're thinking of doing a special show really just digging into that Now, these days, Steve and I overlap a bit because he has a strong interest in this intersection between art and neuroscience, which he has studied a lot more than I have. I have a real passing curiosity with this, and actually my friend Crystalyn Chu, this was part of her focus at university. It's part of her strange degree program that she put together. So among many other wonky and highly specific topics, Steve and I managed to connect on this. To top it all off, he's also a good friend with one of my very best friends, Kevin Geiger. So the small world meter is off the charts with this show for me. So more on all that later. For now, though, you can visit the blog post at crazyinagoodway.com for the links, contact information. And now I hope you enjoy this truly epic conversation with Stephen Katz. Stephen Katz, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you
Although
here.
I'm not actually there.
Right. You are. Well, where are you? Are you Los Angeles specifically right now?
I'm in Los Angeles, so I'm 15,000, 12,000 miles away.
I was a liberal arts major. I think it's about, my memory for I think it's about 6,800 kilometers. So yeah, it's about 5,000 miles.
It's a long way.
I'm not great with the maths, but I do know that it's about a 12 or 13 hour round trip. One way. It's about 12, 13 hours depending on which direction from LA to Beijing. Of course, I'm from LA. Now we're going to get into so many things, and we've been having fun chatting before we actually are doing the show. And I sort of realized, we actually need to get into the show because I'm getting so much interesting context from you. How do you introduce yourself to people who you would like to know better?
Well, let me ask a question about that. Are you talking about how do I make cold calls to meet people, or just people I would meet ordinarily as a way of finding out? How
I
to
just mean
myself?
if people you would like to know, not in a pitchy way, in a fellow peer, but maybe they are, not in a job seeking way or something, but.
Right. Well, I'm a hyphenate. I'm a writer, director, producer, or a director, writer, producer, depending on what I'm doing at the time. But yeah, I think of myself as a filmmaker. And people know me from different things. So there's the book, and I write for some magazines. But then some people know me as a production guy. So, but I would like to be known essentially. Writer, director, producer kind of covers it because I do most of those things. During the course of a year, all of them get quite a bit of my attention and my time.
Fantastic. And it's funny because I know you through your work for, going to age us both here, since the early 90s. And we're going to get to that in a moment because I have this question related to your first, really super visible success, and this may be the one that you mentioned. But let's start a little earlier. Where do you consider your roots? Where are you from, and what was sort of your early days like? Because I want to see how that helped set you on this path that you got on.
Well, I grew up in Westport, Connecticut, which is a very, very arty community. And it's in Connecticut. It's near New York City. And it's the home to a lot of theatrical and motion picture people and illustrators and writers. So I don't know if you know the town at all. It's pretty famous. But
didn't Paul Newman and Joanne Woodward live there?
Yeah. Okay, Okay, so that's it. So there's all those guys. So I grew up in a town where there was certainly, let's say I'd grown up in Texas, I'd probably be thinking football all day long. But at my high school and junior high, the arts were a big thing, and the families that lived there were many of them were advertising in New York City, very much like Don Draper in Mad Men.
Okay,
Westport was absolutely one of those communities. It was a bedroom community feeding New York City, and many of the people were in communication. So that was around me, and my mom and dad. Both had an interest in the arts. My mom was an excellent illustrator, but she gave up and went into regular business and had her own company when I was still quite young. And my dad had sort of already given up his photographic interest, but there were, down in the basement, there were processing trays and all the gear he had sort of stopped using, but I was aware of it. So I grew up in an area where there was a lot of encouragement for all the arts. And that was, I would say, really started me in the directions. I was, grew up in the 60s, the 50s and the 60s. So, certainly know what that means artistically. And I guess what I remember was modernism. That was, so it was Prokofiev and Strauss and music and Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Joyce. It was, all those things are what were sort of the pantheon of artists.
Mm-hmm.
And then but in terms of my motion picture interest, my mom and dad were away a lot. So my sister and I watched way too many movies on TV.
Okay.
And my mom loved the movies, so that was part of a family thing. And I watched the golden age Hollywood films over and over and over again.
Okay.
And then by the time I was 7 or 8, I was given my first camera, and and even at the age of 7 or 8 or 9, just because my parents were in the arts, and we didn't have huge conversations, but, they certainly, it was thought of that I wasn't just taking snapshots.
Right.
And that I was, framing, and that thing was important. I didn't get a lot of instruction, but even at that early age, I was kind of aware that you had to pay attention to those things. And then I got a hold of my dad's 8mm movie camera when I was 9. And that plus a one event that happened when I was in California briefly led me down the path of wanting to do stop motion animation like Ray Harryhausen.
Oh,
and that's true.
Yeah, great reference. I have a lot of old school horror friends whose ears are tingling right now.
That story, by the way, there's thousands of kids of my generation, and Spielberg, Lucas, all those guys who sort of had the same passion. And I'll just tell you where it happened. I grew up in Connecticut, but for 1 year, the family was moved out on business out to San Francisco.
Okay.
And I went to a smoke store, a smoke shop, there, which was like the drugstore with the, they had stools and a bar where you could go get ice cream sundaes and things. And then they had the magazine rack. So I went over to the magazine rack at one time, and I saw my first copy of a thing called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And being a red-blooded American kid, I was into horror films and that of the day, not like a horror film today, and science fiction. And, I was leafing through it, and it was the first time I saw pictures behind the scenes. And they had the stop motion Willis O'Brien's stop motion armature for King Kong. And then they had these incredible drawings, concept art, and storyboards. And I was like, just a light went off, and it suddenly combined all the things I was interested in.
So you could see how they made the donuts a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and so I was just like mesmerized. Oh my God, this is how it works. And at that point, that was kind of it. I was going down that path. Now, I had other interests as a kid: mini bikes, go-karts, some sports, that sort of thing. But the deepest passion I had was for motion pictures, and so that's what I started to do as a hobby in the basement. And back then, there were very few film books, but I started to read those. And I came from a family where there was a lot of interest in. A lot of respect and interest for books. So that was something you got on birthdays and Christmases and other times. And so basically I would call it a kidlit. So it was things like the collected works of Mark Twain and Rudyard Kipling and Jules Verne, H.G. Wells. But it was, and I just liked reading. So I was already, by the time I was 10 or 11, 12, very interested in literature. And as I say, in the town where I came from, this was common among my friends. So I could talk about, a parody of Lord of the Rings, Board of the Rings by Kenny Beard and the guys out of Harvard Lampoon. And so so we would share that stuff. And even, we liked football and the other things too, but it was definitely a different emphasis where I came from. And then all through junior high, I was the kid with the camera, and I could draw. So I was, there's always 3 or 4 kids in your high school class who gets tapped to do the yearbook and other things. And so I did that. So, and that all led to going into high school and Staples High School in Westport had the best theater department in the United States, bar none. It was almost like a professional theater. And we had the Westport Country Playhouse, and I went there in the summer. So I can remember it at 16 sitting in the Playhouse during the summer during rehearsals, and I would go there and I would I could hear Woody Allen direct. I could hear
What?
sure. It was just this dark theater without enough air conditioning, and they'd be rehearsing whatever was the play that was featured that week.
Huh.
And and I sat there and listened to Josh Logan. No one remembers him, but there many directors came through. Many of them were actors who were directors, and they were professional cast. They were people you saw on TV and from the motion pictures in their later years. And so I had this enormous exposure to the arts and entertainment and performing arts pretty much for as long as I could remember. So I'll shut up here.
Well, no, this is great. I have so many questions, but so that's especially, that had to be especially formative because you saw real professionals at a young age, and you also saw them as people, whether or not you approached them per se, but you saw them as people who were right there in the room. You got used to being around people who were working at a professional caliber at a pretty young age. So you weren't among a bunch of people who didn't know what they were doing. You were actually modeling and being mentored by osmosis by people who were really the best at what they do.
Yeah. And when I sat there, I wasn't like, oh, this is theater. I mean, I was already kind of reading theater and with other people who talked about it. And, I was there at the Playhouse. So, when I was sitting there watching the rehearsals, I could come out and talk to people. I didn't interact with the actors or the directors very much at all. That was kind of like sort of prohibited. But I was in there, and it would be almost an empty theater for the 3 days of rehearsal they would have. And it would be dark and a little bit hot, and I would just sit there for half an hour, 45 minutes, and I heard how a director spoke to an actor to guide a performance. And at the same time, I had my dad's cousin, Milton Olsson, was really the top visual effects projectionist in New York City. And what that meant was here's how far back it is. This was in the days of process photography.
So like rear projection, things like that.
Oh, yeah.
Process.
And so I was he owned the gear, and I was there, and I was taught to do it. And I was on set at the age of 10, watching Car 54, Where Are You?
No kidding. Wow.
And then a few years later, I spent a summer on wasn't the summer, but I was going on weekends and sometimes during the week for a show called Hawk.
Okay.
Which was Burt Reynolds before he became famous. And he was a Indian, southwestern Indian in New York City as a detective.
Oh, that was the character he played?
Yeah. And I think it only ran a season or two. And again, I think Pontiac was the sponsor because he was always driving a brand new Pontiac, which they continually polished for every shot.
Right.
And,
so it's like there's a guy in the trunk who gets out to polish the car.
Yeah, and of course it was a union set, so it was limited what I could do, but they would stick it. They had a 2x4 sort of bolted to the frame, and I could push up and down in that when he was driving. They let me do that in a shot.
Oh, nice. So for people who aren't in our racket or aren't as old as us in our racket, who don't even know how this works, without getting too nerdy about it, but basically you're on a stage and there's a screen where like outside the window that's behind the shot. And so that's you're literally the scenery going by is projected onto that. And then like you would be moving the car to simulate the motion of the driving.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how the rear projection.
And it was absolutely absurdly unconvincing.
It's hilarious when you see it now, but it's what we had. And when you watch, back in the day, you accepted this as part of the vernacular of film and TV. And you just kind of graded on that curve. It's like right now, I mean, we know that the superheroes aren't flying around, but yet those movies are hugely popular. People just go with it. It's like they buy the premise, you buy the bits. So people go with it.
But I was that generation of kids like Spielberg and Lucas who were watching this stuff and going, oh my God, this is terrible. Right. At the same time, we would compare it to the covers of science fiction art. Mm-hmm. So even though I wasn't hugely into science fiction by any means, that stuff was around, and you could see, oh my God, Frazetta and many, many, many others. And you'd look at these and say, why can't a movie look like that?
Right.
And then Spielberg and Lucas and others, even in the analog era, made that work. I mean, the first really big breakthrough was 2001.
Right, with Kubrick. Yeah.
And some of those same people then moved over to the George Lucas team for Star Wars, and that was really, we never looked back after that.
Yeah, and I won't tangent this too much, but my old producing partner of 10 years, his uncle was actually the guy that essentially built what became the ranch as a producer in Hollywood, and sort of shepherded Lucas through the trials and tribulations of Fox. And it's a long story. They had a huge argument, and toward the end, he was the last guy of the old Hollywood guys that Lucas ran off. And the famous parting words were, "Screw you and your stupid movie, and you can keep your 5 points." and this is Jimmy Nelson. He's in all the books if anybody wants to get super forensic.
Wow.
He did just fine otherwise, but he gave up 5 points on Star Wars. Is kind of an interesting footnote. Yeah. So in terms of you getting into film professionally, because we're building toward that blue book, of course, but which people who don't already know are wondering what I'm talking about. But how did you actually get so going from your upbringing? How did you sort of decide to do film and TV stuff professionally? And what were sort of those formative professional years like?
Well, by the time I was 12 or 13. My parents and Steve's, they never used the word filmmaker, but they said he's going to make movies. That's what he wants to do. We can't persuade him to become a doctor or a physicist or some other things, but this, he's pretty much chosen his path even at this young age. And then when I went through high school, and I was around that time, and I was very involved in theater lighting and theater and technical backstage aspects of performing arts. And it was the 60s. So we did a show called War and Pieces, which was won a lot of awards, but it had a little bit of a light show in it because that was what was going on. And I'll make this short. I basically was on my 17th birthday. My friends took me to the Fillmore East, which was the rock palace of its day. Sure. And
that's so. Really
and
cool.
I'd already seen little bits
I'm jealous.
Pieces of light show. And the Joshua Light Show was absolutely, without question, the best light show on either coast. There were the West Coast guys, there were the East Coast guys, but that was everybody who really knew this stuff knew they were the most cinematic and the really flawless performances for hours at a clay were fantastic. So I went to this thing, and the music was fine. It was Mott the Hoople.
Oh wow!
If I remember right, it was Mott the Hoople, and this new band that no one had heard of called Creed and Clearwater, and they were debuting.
Okay,
and the headliner was the Turtles.
No kidding! Wow.
And the Turtles were like almost a comedy act because Howie, who would then leave and join Zappa, was like, embarrassed by the whole thing. And so it was all a bit like a send up.
Right. So,
anyway, without having this drag on, I was like, the show is over and I'm still looking at the screen because they left it up with like this amorphous Lumia kind of thing going on. And I was just like, oh my God, how did they do that? And of course, I was already had 5 or 6 years doing process photography and background stuff. And my cousin also didn't just do that. He also did a lot of, the big slideshow support with 80 carousels for corporate things. And I did that too.
So you really knew all the technical stuff.
Right. So going into this, I was, I just said, okay, how do they do it? The next day I get on the train and I come back in. I go home, sleep. Next day I come in and I go down to the Fillmore East and I'm pounding on the stage door for about 4 minutes. And then someone says, why? We're tired. We're closing up for we ended at 3. And I said, well, I want to meet the guy who does a light show. He said, that's Josh White. If you run to the front of the theater, you'll catch him. And I did. And as a 17-year-old who looked 11, I just started saying, oh my God, it was fantastic. And I have some background in this and I'll do anything to learn. And he said, well, I said, I came in this morning. And he said, where'd you come in from? And I said, Westport. And he does a little jump. And he said, well, my dad used to live in Westport and I've got his old Volvo. Do you know where Larry Torino's Volvo dealership is? I said, yeah, it's across the bowling alley. He said, if you take my car and take it out to there for me and drop it off and pick it up in a week when it's finished and drive it back to New York, I'll teach you light shows.
Oh, cool.
And he kept his word. And then I was backstage many, 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 many times and, starting to learn all the gear and where do you buy it and how do you make it. And Bill Schwartzbach there in particular took me under his wings. He was the guy who mainly did the liquids, but And they were all out of the Columbia. They were all out of Columbia Theater School.
Okay.
They're all very smart guys. So anyway, so then I did that, and that was my first professional gig as I got my own light show together. They helped me, and I started doing shows for like the Grateful Dead, Vanilla Fudge,
wow.
The Doors, Sly and the Family Stone.
What? That's amazing.
And I was like 19.
Oh man, that's so cool. I had no idea.
Had to go do this stuff. When I had to go sign contracts, I couldn't sign them because I wasn't 21.
Oh, did you have to be 21 at the time?
Yeah, you couldn't sign a contract, nothing. So anyway, I did that, and it was a little bit of a side trip from motion pictures, which I was still kind of, I was still going on set with my cousin, and but that was with light shows. If you were young, it wasn't a problem. There were no unions.
Mm-hmm.
So I was able to do that. And it was a very short period of time, but that went on for maybe, I don't know, like 2.5 years into my early 20s. And then in my hometown, I ran a series of professional concerts. I talked them in and said, well, I worked at the Fillmore.
Yeah, no kidding.
And this would only happen in the 60s. So I did it was like the Byrds with Delaney and Bonnie and Eric Clapton and Country Joe McDonald's and the Byrds, and I did it. And then I also ran a film, actually 2 film festivals in town. And we rented a real, motion picture projector. I didn't do like the 16 millimeter Kodak pageant projector from the library in the middle of the auditorium. I actually went out and did it for real.
Yeah.
Built a curved screen for 2001. And then I got into bluegrass, and I was doing bluegrass, but I was occasionally doing film. For example, John McTiernan, who was the director of Die Hard and Predator and Red October, he married a friend of mine from high school.
Okay.
And when I was 22, he did his first film called The Demon's Daughter, although it was released as The Tales of the 21st Century, and they all moved into the rabbi's house.
All right.
The rabbi was away for the summer. He gave that to them. And I became like their sound guy with an old Nagra.
Mm-hmm.
I became their production designer for some of the sets.
No kidding.
And they had no money, of course.
Sure.
And so that was John's first picture.
Huh. Wow.
And then music carried me until I was like 26 and 27. And then I said, okay, I'm not going to have a living doing bluegrass banjo.
Yeah,
so I've got to get
it's limited. Unless you're the best guy in the world or the second best guy in the world, it's probably tough to really have that be your career.
Absolutely. It was just not, and I missed it, but I also thought, well, anyway, that was just a career that wasn't going to happen.
But your music really, and I won't derail on me, but this is actually, professional musician was my primary focus through my 20s. And I had my encouragements and notable things along the way. Not quite as some years are really amazing, but yeah. So I can relate to this, and was always also interested in film. And at a certain point, I realized for me that filmmaking was the kind of storytelling that I felt I was here to do, and it's also something I could do forever. As long as you're sentient, you can make films. So how did you transition into the skills that led you to write the book that initially, basically made you famous?
Well, the thing, when I was a kid, I was a little bit academic, and I looked at books to find things out. And I was probably 10, and I had a Craig viewer, if you remember those, an 8 millimeter.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It was like a movie scope.
Right.
And I used to get these. Well, I think in some way I had a general understanding or interest in the technique of film and the way you could produce psychological effects and the whole sort of neuroscience of that. I didn't know that word at the time, but that kind of thing was kind of interesting to me. And so I started to disassemble movies.
Okay.
And I was, I wasn't even just barely a teenager. And I got these films at the local Barker's, which was the equivalent of like a Walmart then. And in the photo department, they had this rotating rack of Castle films. There was also Black Hawk. There were a bunch of them. You could buy these. There were 4 minutes. It'd be like Tarantula with Leo G. Carroll or it'd be a West. Tons of stuff was there. And I would take them and I would slow them down. I said, oh, okay, here's how these shots go together. And I did that, for a fair amount of time. And I had a knack for it. I mean, I think I took where I had an aptitude, and then at a very early age, because there was no real formal training of this kind going on, I just started to figure it out myself.
Mm-hmm.
And that was something sort of throughout my, I was editing films in my teens, and and I just had a Bolex, and I graduated from 8 millimeter to 16 millimeter, and of course then when I was working with my cousin, I was around serious gear, so I kind of knew, even by the time I was 14 or 15, I probably knew 75% of what you get in film school.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been doing it.
Sure.
So anyway, so now I'm playing music. I'm in my 20s, and I just decide, well, I've got to get back to this thing. I've been doing it so long. I have all this grounding in it, and I don't have the same grounding in music. I learned to play bluegrass, but a year or two into it with a teacher or two, I learned, okay, I have to learn chords, and you have to learn like sort of the underlying system and music theory. And I did some of that, but I realized, these kids who start playing at the age of 6, 7, 8, or 9, and by the time they're 10 or 12, they're already highly accomplished.
Right.
And I didn't do that. Also, music is a language, and you really do learn it faster when you're young.
This is
so
true.
Starting at 20 was just not.
I
then
feel
at
really lucky
26,
to have started guitar like at 8 or 9 or whatever it was.
Oh, man,
it made all the difference.
I'm so jealous because you're absolutely right. I don't know how anybody does it starting much later. But anyway, so now I'm 26 or 27, and I had a friend who was at the University of Connecticut. So I went out and stayed with him, and then found I could get a place to live in the grad dorms with him, and took some courses. And basically what happened was there was a screenwriting course with a guy who was the David Haberstrom, I think it is, who was the producer of 310 to Yuma, the original version.
All right, yeah. They remade it a while back with Christian Bale, but yeah, that was a remake. Yeah,
it was a remake. So and he did that and a bunch of other things. And he was a Hollywood guy who would, Hollywood gave up on Hollywood in his mid 60s and came to Connecticut with his wife, who was also a screenwriter. And they had real careers out there.
Sure.
So I wrote a script, and I brought it to him, and he said to me, "Why should I read this? You didn't take my class." And he said, I leave it on the desk. I'll get to it when I get to it. And like a weekend later, he calls me up. He said, "KATZ, I want to have lunch with you."
Huh.
I had lunch, and he said, this is the first script I've had handed me from a student, and he said, in 4 years, that I thought really was even semi-producible. He said, "You're talented. I'll help you out a little bit."
Nice.
So he did help me out and introduced me to some people. And then I came, I left and decided that's what I was going to do. So then I was writing for a couple of years, and I was getting gigs as a production manager and commercials and even PA work, whatever I could get. Picked up some editing work. I worked at R&S Films briefly doing sound editing. So I was on a flatbed. And then I decided, and Saturday Night Live was on at the time, and it was the hottest thing out there. So I said, I'm going to make a short for them. And everybody counseled me, don't even think about it. They said, Albert Brooks can get shorts on. You can't. Everybody is offering them free film, every commercial director in New York City. Right. So I said, screw it, I'm doing it anyway. And so I did a parody of Brian De Palma, who at the time was, one of the top directors in the world, but clearly ripping off Hitchcock and what he called an homage, but not all of us felt that's what it was.
Yeah.
And, he lifted his technique, the POV technique.
Sure.
In ways that were kind of, wow, that's a little bit close.
A little on the nose, yeah.
So, yeah, but Brian's a good guy, and he's a good director. And so, anyway, but he was really a big deal at the time. And so I made this thing and really ran out of money. It took quite a while, and it was like a trailer, and it showed essentially the scene in The Birds where everybody's running down the street.
Okay.
And but instead of doing birds, we used clams, and it was called The Clams.
This sounds. I think I've seen this.
So it became famous. So what happened was I had this enormous. I had a bunch of short pieces, and then the thing. And instead of taking like a 400-foot film can which would have been big enough, I took like a 2,000-foot can. It was like like a pizza.
Yeah.
Size, large pizza size, and I go to NBC. And I get in the line, and there's the guard, and one by one, people having to show why they should be allowed to go into the building. And I had nothing, and he looks at me with the can under my arm, and he says, "You're in the long line. If you're making deliveries, you need to go to that elevator over there." He said, "You're delivering something, right?" And I go, "Oh yeah, I'm delivering something." So, lucky break is this elevator took me to the floor. He told me the floor. I go up there, I go in, and there are 2 floors for SNL, one in which there's a regular reception desk and then there's the production floor. And I got in the production floor, and there's nobody.
Wow.
And I'm wandering around. And finally, after about 5 minutes, the producer is coming towards me.
Lorne Michaels?
Bob Tischler. Yeah, okay. No, it wasn't Lorne. It was Bob Tischler. And because Lorne took a year off to go to Hollywood, which he regretted.
That's right.
This guy's coming at me, and I babble this ridiculous kind of introduction, and this is unsolicited. Please look at it. And he says, "Yeah, okay, let me look at it." They go into a room and they screened it, and I couldn't even go in the room because I was worried they wouldn't laugh.
Right.
And they're laughing, and he comes out and he says, "Yeah, we're going to buy it."
Amazing.
And then. Now, this was in August, and the show had not gone on. They're weeks away from the first show.
Mm-hmm.
They ended up taking the short and putting it in the first 2 minutes of the opening season show.
Wow.
Because it was so strong. And then the next day in the New York Times, they said a pretty good start with a new season and modified cast for SNL, but with one real high point, which was the Clams, harkening back to the best of SNL in their early season. So,
oh my gosh. What that's amazing praise. What was who were the new cast members? Like what was sort of that
oh
shift?
My God, I think Tim Kazurinsky, I think, okay. And I'm not 100%, I think who else
was Kevin Nealon? Did he come on then, or was that later?
I think Eddie Murphy, that may have been his first season, but I'll have to check. It was 1980. And then I was taken under the wing. Remember Mr. Mike? He was Michael O'Donoghue. He was one of the original writers.
He was the legendary writer at SNL.
Yeah.
Really helped shape the show as much as like almost any single person besides Lorne Michaels is what most people would say, I think.
Yeah, O'Donoghue really was the senior guy there from the Harvard, from the Lampoon, excuse me. And he took me under his wing. And then he got fired because he basically did the show wasn't doing that well that year into the season, and he did the longest piece they had done to date in the show, which was like a 7-minute attack on Fred Silverman, the head of the network, comparing him to Hitler in the bunker.
Oh no! Wow.
Yeah, no, it made front page all over.
I remember that. I remember that.
Society and everything, right?
Uh-huh.
And said you got to have real balls to be taking on, your boss of the boss of bosses.
Exactly.
So he didn't, and then he left, and I wasn't there. But I had already pitched a second thing we were going to do, which was at the time the Shroud of Turin was on the front page of, I think, in November, the front page of Time or U.S. News and World Report, something like that, because the Vatican agreed to have a thread carbon tested.
Right.
And so I wrote a parody for Christmas, which was going to be Polaroid Insta Shrouds. You don't have to be a Messiah to get big, beautiful prints in just 30 seconds.
Awesome.
So it's like everybody's at the dining room table, and Grandpa falls over dead, and then they come out with this like roll of Saran wraps, and they pull this sheet of Polaroid Insta Shroud over him, and then they get an image. So
wow.
And unfortunately, it got censored. It was like they cut one piece off it every week for 5 weeks, and then Michael was gone, and then that was over. So that was my introduction, and exit from Saturday Night Live. And I probably could have continued there, but in solidarity, Michael's gone. So
yeah, if he was your guy. Your champion.
And then that got me an agent and some other,
Sure.
And then I was in the industry, and I met a guy, John Goodyear, who was from my hometown, or was living in my hometown at the time. And he was a very well-known music video producer. And he heard about me, and we met. And so I worked for him doing storyboards and some production art and kind of things, really for a few months. And he finally, but he got to know me very well. And we would talk about films, and I was pretty encyclopedic in those days. And he said, man, you know much more. He said, you're more of a director than I am, so I'm going to back you. Huh. And then we had a company for a bunch of years, and that took me through a hunk of the 80s. And we're doing commercial production and a couple of music shows, and that was it was a good time. Our goal was to try and make our own indie features. I only had an interest in features, but I did get to work with real professional crews and stuff doing commercials. So that went on for some time. And then now we're getting into the, let's skip ahead to the late 80s. Yeah. I got married. I got an agent in California who said, you've got to stay here to be able for me to sell you. Right. You can't do this from the East Coast.
You need to pop into a meeting with short notice, things like that.
Right. So it's all about pitching, and it's a relationship driven business. Right. So, right. But my wife didn't want to do that, and I came back and felt I could do an indie approach to, rather than doing the full on Hollywood approach, which was probably a major mistake.
Looking back, you might go, okay, this is a fork in the road here.
It's a fork in the road, and I stepped on the fork, and
got
so then and then I was still in Connecticut, and I hooked up, and then my first partner got married and moved out of the area, and we dissolved the company, and I joined another company. This is the guy that did the 24-track sound studio. Mm-hmm. Great guy, Cliff Pia, and we did that for a year and a half or 2 years, and now I'm 39. My feature stuff isn't going. My agent isn't real. I'm not out there, and I'm thinking, this is not good. Got separated from my wife. A lot of turmoil, and during that time, I met Michael Wiese. Actually, I met him before, mm-hmm. and we became friends. And so one day at a diner in Westport, Connecticut, he said, I'm doing a publishing company, I think. At the time, he was the head of non-theatrical programming at Vestron, when Vestron was a pretty big deal.
Yeah, this was a top, for people who wouldn't know, Vestron was a top video company back when home video really ruled tape really ruled the earth.
Right. And essentially what the deal was with Austin First, who I think that's his name, started the company. He had been at Time Life or something, and they had a golden parachute for him, and he traded it for electronic rights back in 81, right as VHS and beta is just happening. Oh, they didn't know what the hell that meant. Shoot. And he had this enormous library.
Wow. This is kind of like Lucas making the deal for merch on Star Wars before anybody knew what that could be.
Exactly.
Not quite as big, probably, but probably significant.
Right. So anyway, that's where I met Michael, and Michael had done his own little comedy short, so we had something in common. And I did some comedy stuff for him at Vestron. We did these little shorts, the video baby, the video dog, the video boyfriend, the video girlfriend. And they were all these silly 10-minute things we did. Mm-hmm. And then I had the publishing company just starting it out. And he said, Steve, you know so much about filmmaking and the visual side and putting it together. Mm-hmm. I bet there's a book there. And a week later, I handed in a TOC, a table of contents.
Right.
And he said, yeah. And then I wrote the book, which I thought would take 6 months, and a year and a half or 2 years later, I was still working on it. But then it came out, and it was almost from the get-go. It was an event, right? At least in that kind of that slice of publishing. And then on the basis of that, I got a call from Michael one day. He said, "We got this weird call, Steve. Someone purporting to represent Michael Jackson says Michael wants to meet you. He wants to be a film director, and we're checking it out." I come back a week later and said, "Yep, it's real. It really is him. He's going to call you on Thursday night."
Wow.
So I get this call from Michael Jackson on a Thursday night. He's at the peak of his career. He's 33 or 34 years old, 92 or something. And so he does. He makes the pitch. Yeah, would you come out and stay at the ranch for an extended period of time? And then for several months, we couldn't get it together. He kept canceling, and I was pretty much writing it off. And then finally he was like, "Get out here next week." And I moved out, and I lived at the ranch in 1993 in the summer. And I was there for weeks and weeks and weeks, and one-on-one with no one else around, I would teach Michael shot flow.
What? And you were Michael Jackson's directing teacher. Let's not blow past this. You were brought out to live at Neverland Ranch for the summer of 92, and you were Michael Jackson's private directing teacher. 93. Okay.
Yep.
Wow.
And I lived in this gorgeous bungalow. And Michael would show up some days and sometimes not. And Michael had made the deal for Michael, the publisher had made the deal for me. And he basically asked for my commercial day rate, which is very high.
Sure.
And hey, but it's Michael Jackson. I'm living on a ranch where there's, he's got a zoo and he has like his own movie theater and there's, an amphibian. There's, he had an amphibian zoo. Which was, all these, it was a big building and anyway, had all that stuff. And I'm thinking, okay, he can afford this. So, and I lived there, but some days he wouldn't show up and they would call me in the mornings. Oh, we're so sorry. Michael had to take the helicopter down to LA to record some tracks over, but he says he promises he'll be there tomorrow. So, and I just hung out there and it was a little bit weird. I don't know how much you want to talk about this, but I could go on for quite a while about the experience of being at the ranch.
Well, that sounds like something I'd love to do a show just about that, basically. But let's come back to that in a second. I want to say, I will have said this in the intro that I haven't recorded as I'm talking to you right now in real time. But the book we're talking about is Film Directing Shot by Shot.
Yeah.
Which was, as I said to you, privately, it came out. I was in film school at Georgia State University, not a well-known program, although a young program, and now it's very established and not something that's a name program, but it's it has really good instructors and program there. But I remember that Gary Moss, who was my beloved production instructor, came in one day when that book was first edition, first printing, hot off the presses. And was basically saying, hey guys, check this out. This was just put out, and all these things that he had been doing with handouts and his own like drawing on the board, all of a sudden you had taken the basic vernacular of filmmaking, of shots and framing and how things cut and, relating it to different genres and why you would do certain things. And it was really all in one. And it was the most comprehensive, practical book, hands-on book related to this at the time extremely esoteric topic. And still there are tons of, YouTube videos and things now where people talk about it. Half the time they, their training is mostly self-taught or something, but this was legit. This was something legit, and it became the most passed around thing. And, we probably owe you some royalties from all the Xeroxing, but then everybody ended up buying their copies. So I think it all worked out, it probably balanced itself out like the next semester because like it became a textbook. It became a required reading for the course for the next semester. So that book is I'm going to say that's one of the top 5 books that I've gifted to people over the years. Wow. Yeah. So thanks for writing that book. My copy is back in my storage in LA, my old copy, my brand new copy of the 25th anniversary we'll get to that in detail later, but you did the big anniversary edition, and my cinematographer, Naeem Sarafi, he has that right now and he's going through it and enjoying it and is just blown away. He's like, this is because he had never seen the original somehow. He's like, wow, this has been around. I'm like, yeah, this is how I learned what I'm talking about in a lot of ways. So, thank you for that book. And like you said,
thank you for buying it. That's 10 cents in my pocket, I think.
Sweet. Well, I've given you about $1.20 now, I guess, over the years, $1.50 maybe, possibly. But, so that really, that was one of those big landmarks that really helped to establish you in a different area. So in publishing and so, yeah, this Michael Jackson gig, I wouldn't mind doing 5 more minutes on that if you have like let's jump back to the narrative because that's pretty fascinating. So was he just wanting to learn it, or he had an idea that he was going to direct his own videos? He wanted to actually do it.
Feature films.
Okay.
And I to wrap it up a little bit. So anyway, the summer that I was there, Michael wanted to be a film director. He had already directed a short, which only a handful of people have seen. It's in Panavision. It's widescreen, ultra widescreen, like CinemaScope.
Yeah.
And which most student films are not. And It starred Sophia Loren's son.
Okay.
And he had just done that like a year or two before I got out. And he knew a great deal about film because, Scorsese had directed one of his music videos. Sure. Had many others, John Landis, and he asked a lot of questions. So he knew the line, he knew the 180-degree line, and he knew quite a bit. He knew something about lenses. So that summer, unfortunately, there were kids coming and going, and one of them, whose name was Jordy, was there the most at one period. And we would make these little shorts, and so Jordy wasn't left out. We would, he would sometimes handle the camera, sometimes he would, it would be him and Michael. We'd do scenes, and he was the kid who first accused Michael. And so, at the end of the summer, Norma Stikos, who ran the Empire, said, Michael really likes you. He feels very comfortable with you. You're very down to earth with him. You're not trying to get something all the time, and he appreciates that. And he wants you to come on tour with him and shoot a documentary of the tour. You're going to be the documentarian for the tour. Are you interested in doing that? You'll be away for 7 months. You'll lock your house up, and you'll travel in a way you probably never would ever travel again. You'll be on a private plane.
Yeah.
And so I said, well, of course. And then my teaching gig was over, and now they were going to move into doing the tour. Mm-hmm. And that started, I don't know, in end of August, maybe early September. And week by week, they were postponing, and then it hit the press.
Okay.
And it all blew up, and then the tour was canceled, and so that was that. But fast forward to 2002, they get in touch with me again. I go out again, and I returned to the ranch and did a mini version of but this time he had a movie he wanted me to produce, and I was never fully. When we do a specific thing about this separately, I have my views about what I thought at the time, whether it was real or not, and I had enough doubt that he was guilty that but I was uncomfortable with it. But I went back and I did this short thing and had these one strange. I remember he had to go down and do depositions in LA. So when they flew me out, I didn't go directly to the ranch. I went to the Beverly Wilshire, and Michael had taken over an entire floor, and his suite was 3,000 square feet.
Wow.
And he would call, so I would be there. And then I remember one night at midnight, I get this call, and he says, Steve, can you come on over? There's a lot of food. Let's watch movies. So I go over, and we go in his bedroom, and he's got the screen up. He's got like a 70-inch screen, and I sit next to him. He's on the bed. I'm in a chair, and we watch the Stephen Sommers version of The Mummy. And Michael keeps stopping. How did they do that? Why did they do that? I like this. And we did for like an hour. And ate leftover Chinese, because he'd had some business meeting, and there was all this food left. So that was like, and I just could, I was sitting there thinking, this is too strange. So anyway, that was, I have many other Michael stories, but that was,
we'll have to circle back around to that and do a special episode. I had no idea about that, or I would have framed some of these questions, would have worked that.
Well, you'll be the first.
Oh, you never talked about it.
I've told these stories, but I've never told them. They're definitely not unpublished, and I've sort of kept them private all these years.
Well,
because I didn't really want to be pulled into. But most recently, when it was a lot of turmoil, I didn't want to end up on, Entertainment Tonight or whatever the hell it is. For 45 seconds, the guy was at the ranch.
I got it. Well, let's definitely circle back to that, because I think there's a lot to get into there, and it would be good for us for me to know what I'm going to ask you about before I stumble through the woods a bit. I know some people from the music world who worked with him on the music side and had nothing but great professional things to say about him in the studio, but that was the context in which they knew him. They didn't know him from his home life and stuff.
Yeah. He was great with me. I have no complaints. He was extremely nice and a very sweet guy, and very smart. And also, he spent. I'll leave that part of our stuff with this. Is that he was continually trying to impress me. I'm living in his $1 billion empire, which is 2,500 acres, of which he owns the mountain.
Okay.
And just extravagance every place you look. There's a train. There's just a theater. There's the zoo. There's all these things, stable, all this stuff. And he's trying to impress me because he wasn't formally educated.
Right.
And so it was kind of strange. I'd look around me at this vast opulence and think, and yet he felt, I guess, had a lot of embarrassment.
Yeah.
That he was in the arts, but everybody else was better educated than he. So
well, I'll let's wrap up this section. But I'll mention. I actually mentioned my old. It's his story to tell in any detail. I know it secondhand, but I've heard it so many times with so many pieces. My old producing partner and best friend of 10 years. His father was like actually a pretty legendary TV director and directed some movies. But old school director, started as an AD. Their family's in the business since the beginning. And they had this estate in Encino where they lived. And when the Jackson 5, moved there and became a thing, they had a whole big giant back part of the land. They sold that became the Jackson 5. That's where Joe Jackson bought that. And that was their big house in Encino where Michael grew up. And so my buddy, I'm 51 and so is my old partner. So we were about 5-6 years younger than he would have been. But so he grew up as a little kid, seeing Michael as a young teenager, playing basketball, sometimes with brothers, but usually by himself. And so, he knew him, as a kid and saw this, but that's a whole story and God knows I don't want to be throwing out random things. But the stories that, everything that I heard, any insights, it cements what everybody else has heard about growing up with Joe Jackson. So I can only imagine what that would do to a guy. So moving on back to the film business. So where did you go from there, kind of for better or for worse? So the Michael, and there was intervening time as well, but where did you go from there? How did you get into China? We've got to talk about all of this.
Okay, sure. Well, anyway, so now it's the early 90s. The book is out and I'm getting a lot of, press for that in the trades. And then I did the thing for Michael, and then almost that same year, a friend of mine, Ralph Singleton, who's a well-known producer, was doing Clear and Present Danger for Bob Ramey and Mace Newfield. Yeah. And so I was teaching at the AFI. I was doing workshops about the book. Ralph knew I was over there. Said, "Hey, you got to come by Paramount and visit." So I did. And so I'm sitting down with Ralph. He said, we got this terrible problem. We had a location for the big action sequence when they're trapped in a narrow street. Harrison Ford and the other American CIA or whatever they are. And he said it was we lost the location, and it was originally an east-west street. And therefore, as the sun goes over, there's no shadows.
Oh, okay, right.
It's parallel. It's kind of going the same direction.
Same path as the sun.
Now they get a new location, and this time
it's crossed.
It's right. It's north-south. And so I said, "Hey, I got software. I know." At this point, I was early into computer graphics for movies. And this is really very early on. And I said, "Gee, Ralph, I can take care of that for you. I can build a set of shapes to be the street, and I can tell you, give me the longitude, latitude, or the name of the city and where it is, and the time of day you're going to shoot, and I can give you 12 images of where the shadows are going to be." He said, "Oh, that's fantastic." And then that conversation went into what else I could do, which really what I was describing was digital previs. Although there was no previs, there was no digital previs.
Right.
And so then he takes me onto set, and Harrison's there, and Philip Noyce, the director, is there, and he waits for Philip to leave because this is significant. Philip leaves, and he pulls me aside with Mace Newfield and says, "Steve's got this thing he says he can do to kind of, we've got storyboards, but Steve can do this other thing, which is more like a, Saturday morning cartoon and because, we'll keep Philip sort of under control. He's been shooting, they were over budget and shooting too much." And Philip's a very professional guy, so he wasn't out of control, but he liked to shoot a lot, and they were over budget. So anyway, they said yes. And then I returned, and then I did the first digital previs for a movie.
Wow.
And
on Clear and Present Danger.
Clear and Present Danger. And I get the thing done, and I bring it back, and I have to say, even by today's standards, it was pretty impressive. And so, it had sound, it had music, it had sound effects, and we had we didn't have Harrison, but we got pictures of Harrison and animated them so you couldn't tell he blinked, and we did the whole sequence in 3D.
What?
And I got
you did it in 3D?
This is all in 3D.
Jeez.
And when 3D was so new that practically very few people really knew the software.
My jaw's on the floor for the audience. I mean, film people understand how kind of bananas that is. But you basically did you see this as like a real shot to kind of blow people's minds or like to push the boundaries of what was possible?
I did.
I mean, it's like I'm going to do this the best I can possibly do it.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The money didn't. I didn't pay attention to the money. I just, we're doing this thing, and
you got this shot, and you're not going to blow it.
Well, I mean, even in the original shot by shot that you had, there's mention of software,
right.
And so I was already, and no one had done it, so I said I'm going to do it, and so I did, and it became it was like a big hit. It was on Entertainment Tonight, and they ran my stuff on the top, and then the actual movie on the bottom to compare. To show how close they were.
Yeah.
And then it was in tons of other books. The guy who was the senior tech engineer senior scientist at Avid wrote a book on digital production. He did 3 pages. And there was a European magazine that did like 10 pages. But then it was in all over the place for like a year or so. Mm-hmm. It got me a lot of press and credibility. And so I had the book, Michael Jackson. I had the Clear and Present Danger. And I was about to go try and get a feature going in California, and it looked like it was going to be a long haul, and I felt I needed a gig. So I came back to New York City, and I was introduced to the folks over at Curious Pictures. And Curious Pictures was the biggest animation studio in New York City. They did Pee-wee's Playhouse, and they also had a camera department with 2 Mitchell Rackovers. We had 2 motion control rigs that were a ton apiece. We had green screen stage. We had multiple stages. We had a Oxbury down shooter. We had a props and set department. It was impressive, wow. And they were doing mixed media. That was their thing. And the only thing they weren't doing was digital. And they said, hey, we heard about you. Can you come in here and talk to us? So I did. And I brought a Illustrators Annual. And I said, because I'd already heard, they already allowed me, they allowed me to know that they weren't going to build what Hollywood was building, was a $2 or $3 million department overnight.
Sure.
And so I said, you don't have to do that. I said, because basically computer graphics are based on a model, a tech model, which is essentially is photorealism. Mm-hmm. I said, but you don't have to do that. And I said, here's an Illustrator Annual. And I just went from page to page showing that. I said, you could do these styles and you sort of do an end run. This stuff is beautiful. We can put it in motion in the computer. But you don't have all the overhead of photorealism, which is, right. Expensive.
Yeah.
So they jumped on that, and then I built that department, and it was pretty. Certainly, it was. We were way ahead of the curve for a year or two in New York City because we replaced their post production with After Effects and all tools that were brand new.
Yeah.
And it was incredibly difficult to do, but I did that for a bunch of years, and and it was interesting. They had TV shows, they had commercials. Primarily commercials. And then while I was there, I did for Robert Wilson and Philip Glass, they were doing a 3D stereoscopic opera. And okay. I got to be the creative director on that for a bit. They brought it to us because they never had any money.
I remember write-ups about this. Yeah.
Yeah. So I put time into that and did that. So it was an interesting period of my life. And then I felt I wasn't being treated properly. They weren't really promoting me as a director as much as I wanted to be. And they felt it was a conflict of interest if I'm running the department, even though I was a creative director and I was doing both. So I ended up leaving with 2 other guys there, their senior producer and and their top animator, and we left because we all had the same complaints. And I liked the people at Curious, and it's just that they were partners and just didn't want to give anything up. So we said, well, okay, and we started our own shop, and we did that for a few years. Then I get to the early 2000s, and we did very well. And Barry Diller tried to buy our company, but the NASDAQ crashed, and we were heavily invested in a thing called Pitch TV, which I concocted, which was going to be the first online entertainment thing. But there wasn't enough broadband out there to support it. So we were really way ahead of the curve, too far ahead of the curve. And so then when the NASDAQ tanked, the various investment deals we had looked for went away. Mm-hmm. And we said, oh, God, well, let's get back to our commercial production and we'll build up the money again, our war chest, and get back to features. And then 9/11 hit.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And that really was the end. we had spent a lot of money doing this and gambled on this thing, and we had a lot of we had clients that were out of the Midwest, and they just weren't coming to New York. And I don't really blame them. It was a terrible place to be for 6 months to a year, but that killed us. And so I left, and I said, guys, I've got to do features. I can't build this up for another 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And I wasn't a kid anymore. And I said, this is it. I got to do features. This is what I bet my life on. Mm-hmm. So I turned around and started to do that, and was getting little gigs here and there, and some big gigs, and just by myself. And I should also mention that starting in 1992, I was a senior contributing editor at Millimeter Magazine, which in its day was the top production magazine. Yeah. So that was going on all the time that I was at Curious and at Michael Jackson's. All these things were concurrent in those first 2 or 3 years. And so a decade later, I'm now, still writing for the magazine. And I got a call from Eric Watson, who was the producer for Darren Aronofsky. Mm-hmm. And they had an animated film they wanted to do, but it was R-rated. And they'd gotten some Disney money for development. Not a huge amount, but enough to do a script and some tests and all that. And they had heard that I was a guy that, hey, he created Curious Pictures. It was or Curious Digital, which is a brand new kind of way of doing things, and it was a model for Nickelodeon and MTV and other people, and they caught up very quickly. But I did get some credit for that. So they said, "Can you help us? Can you come on and produce?" So I did that, and I looked at what they had, and we all kind of agreed the script was kind of had a flaw at its core in the story. And so I didn't think it was going to go, but they were paying me and they had the Disney money. So then I said, you can't do this for 30, 40, 50, 60, 80 million. And so we talked about what the budget should be. And then we agreed it had to be done out of the country. So I started to put the word out various places, including, Asia in general, because I had in fact done a lot of 2D work at Curious and other places, in Korea and the Philippines, and they had been doing 2D finishing for all the animated studios in the U.S. for 30 years. Right. You did all the key poses, and then all the in betweens were done in Asia. So anyway, to make a long story short, a 3D company heard that I wanted to that I was looking for a studio. And so this company, GDC, which was doing their first feature, and they were the first big CGI studio in China, and they said, well, you got to come over and see our place. We'll fly you over. So they flew me over for like a week, and then they piggybacked that. They got me a teaching gig at Shanghai University, which became like a way bigger thing than I ever could have imagined. And then I was there, and they said, would you look at our movie? And what they were doing was, Jean-Jerome Mobius is one of the most famous graphic novel illustrators. He's French. Right. And a legendary guy. He was in heavy metal in the early days.
Sure, I remember him from that.
Right. So we were doing Through the Mobius Strip. They were doing Through the Mobius Strip. Oh. And so I looked at it, and I said, man, they had major problems. And so I said, well, I wrote them up 14 pages of notes, and they looked at it, and they said, would you come and fix it? We got to get the can to show something. Yeah. So I didn't want to do it. My wife didn't want me to do it. And so we concocted a deal that was so expensive and had a poison pill in it. We felt that they wouldn't do it. And the poison pill is that I wouldn't report to the director. The director was a Disney guy who was really a visual effects soup guy who had just moved into co-directing like a direct-to-DVD thing for Disney. And so he was completely overwhelmed. And it wasn't all his fault, but he wasn't really from the story side specifically. Got it. And he was very good at managing the teams as best he could. It was 300 people in this immense studio, and like 100 of the people in the studio lived in the studio, and they ran it like a motel. It was all very slick. So anyway, so there it was. I was there, and they said yes to my terms, and I said, oh my God.
No, you have to do this thing.
What am I going to do now? And so, but it was very good money. And so sure enough, I just sat there and I said, I'm going to, hand me over everybody I need. Here's what's going to happen. And I just started storyboarding. Yeah. And I took all the stuff I felt didn't work and thumbnailed it. And I did that. So we rebuilt a lot of it, recut it,
Mm-hmm.
There's another editor who came in from a gal from the West, whose name I can't remember. And she brought a real editor over, and that was a help. He was only there for like a month, and I stayed for many months. And then that was it, and I left. And then sometime later they brought me back, and they had more trouble. And like a year later, the CEO was kind of running around trying to get money to keep it going because they had run out of money. Mm-hmm. They were in big trouble. And the chairman of the board, a very, very famous attorney in China, we grew to like each other and trust each other. And he said, you got to bail me out of this. This is terrible.
Yeah.
And he said, I've raised money from all my professional contacts. So I came out, and then I basically became I was the CEO. It was a publicly listed company, and I met the board on Jockey Club, and they approved it. And it was never announced to the press, but I was running the place. And so, and then I finished the film, and I was flying to Australia to do the post-production and to Hollywood to re-record. We had Mark Hamill as one of the voices, and this crazy 4 or 5 month post-production process, and we get it done. And that was the end of that. And I was radicalized to China, though, by that time. I said, oh, my God, this is fantastic.
Yeah.
But even though I worked in the mainland in Shenzhen, the company was headquartered in Hong Kong, and everybody who I interacted with was really Hong Kong Chinese, which is completely different from the mainland.
Right. Exactly.
And in Hong Kong, they believe in contracts, and they do things in a business. So in a way, their business culture is quite close to international standards.
Exactly.
And that was cool. And then almost a year went by, and I was back in the States, and I did some consulting. I made a couple of trips over with other producer friends to try and help them out with some things. And somewhere along there, I met folks from Xing, and Becky Bristow, who was at the time, she was a partner in the company, a junior partner, and their partner was Li Fong Wong, who was a Chinese. And anyway, so Becky
I know him. I knew him.
Oh yeah. So Becky is the chair of the animation department at Cal Arts, which is like the Harvard B School for animation.
Yeah.
And she was there, and she said, Steve, come and stay. And I did. And then, it was a very different situation. It was an extremely different situation. And it was more like typical top-down, absolute authority vested in one person, regardless of background. And so we ran it. And then the three of us tried to get to make it happen as a feature film company. So I got a couple of TV shows on air. We did some outsourced work we did some shots for Twilight and a number of other films. And so, they did as well as most mainland companies can do, because, at the end of the day, they're not going to turn to the West and say, okay, you figure out a plan, you manage the plan, you do the plan. And so China would rather really do it with mistakes, however long it takes, than to turn it over to Westerners. That's just a sad reality in the country.
Well, also, and they're paying for the learning experience too, which is something that my original podcast, Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom, has talked to a lot of the top professionals working here. If I'd known you previously, I would have roped you into that if we had overlapped. And I also do a show called How China Works with a Chinese co-host, where we dissect why do things work the way they do? Where do these cultural things come from? And so this is something that's coming out of my ears and that I lecture about and I consult about. So I get it, but for the sake of the audience, it's a very esoteric topic if you're not China focused, but if you are, then you're nodding with everything that basically Steve says right now. You understand everything he's saying, and you can read into this a lot.
Yeah, and Kevin,
Kevin Geiger,
certainly right. He knows the drill. We worked together. He came over to Xing. We tried to do things. He's a friend, and I was always impressed that he was willing to say these things while he was there, which I elected not to do. It would just, would have poisoned already difficult situations.
Well, and for just because people don't know, Kevin Geiger, he's ex Disney in Burbank, started on the artistic side, and he's ex exec on Disney China. And he's actually one of my best friends. He's been on my other podcasts several times. We have a recurring check-in feature once a month on one of my shows. And Kevin is actually an executive producer now on my current feature that we're developing. He's joined us as an EP officially as about a week and a half ago. So a little disclosure on all that.
Cool. Well, so Kevin, certainly then, and Rob Kane he wasn't over in Beijing, although he spoke Mandarin and lived in Hong Kong when he was quite a bit younger. He was traveling back and forth trying to be one of those guys that could be a bridge. And he comes from the finance side, really. Right. Although I guess he writes screenplays too. But Rob Kane had a blog that really said things that you couldn't, it would be the end of your career in China.
Exactly.
If you spoke about the things he spoke about.
I've interviewed Rob as well, with Rob being in LA.
Yeah. Well, I saw him not too long ago, back about 8 months ago. I had joined Xing Xing in 2007, and with the goal of doing feature films, helping them get to be able to do that. And they were starting with outsource, and we were building from there. And so then around 2012 or 2013, I created a story and then a screenplay that we wanted to do. I hired another screenwriter, Dave Freeman. He came in and worked with me for a bit towards the end. And then I had an animated screenplay called Smart. And at that point, Xing Xing moved me back to Los Angeles. And we then hired a director, John A. Davis, who was the creator of Jimmy Neutron. And also did The Ant Bully for Tom Hanks's company, Playtone. And a very nice guy. Had his own studio, very capable, and he loved the script. So then we set up in Burbank. I moved into Pasadena, and in Burbank I set up a pre-production story room. And that consisted of production designer, editor, 5 or 6 story artists, storyboarders, and a head of story. And John and me and a production assistant or two. And for the next 10, 11 months, we started to create the story reels. And during that time, they were trying to sell the movie. And ultimately, for a way longer story, and for which I don't have all the answers, we were unable to get it funded. And so the Chinese, Xing Xing, was getting tight on funds. And so it just ended. It just shut it down. And it was very, very sad. I'd spent a lifetime to get a feature going. And we spent, probably a couple of million got spent or more.
Wow.
So it was a real deal. And, we had, John is WGA. He's a he's Directors Guild. It was all a straight ahead real production, budgeted around $24 million. And that ended. And then I stayed with Xing Xing about another 7 or 8 months. And that brings me to 2017, I guess, in the middle. And then I was an orphan.
Okay.
And what do I do now? And because it happened kind of, certainly I had not anticipated this kind of conclusion.
Sure.
And so then I was out and so for the last few years, I decided, okay, I'm going to put time and energy into my own properties again, and some of them will be DIY if I have to, because that's kind of what's happening in the industry, both for book publishing and YouTube for, creating comedy shows or what have you.
Right.
And at the same time, working down on the mainstream. And so that's kind of what I've been doing. And I've had, I did manage to pull together a couple of fairly long projects, but they were in Asia. They were in China, I should say. And they encountered the same problems. They would go for some period of time. It looked like I'd have a 2 or 3 year gig, and then the company would fold its tents, or someone would look at something. They would look at the project and say, "Well, we're just not going to do this anymore."
Yeah,
lost our interest. Each one was a unique ending, and so that and that sort of brings me to today when I'm bringing out a YA novel, and I have an animated show on air, which is kind of a little fun thing that I do, and then feature projects. And I'm about to direct for another screenwriter. She wrote a terrific, really one-act play, turned it into a short I guess maybe it started as a short, but anyway, it's like a one-act play,
Mm-hmm.
all character driven, and I'm directing that probably in the next 6 to 8 weeks.
Oh, fantastic. And you mentioned you have an animated show on the air. Did I hear you right?
Well, yeah, it's called Nancy X. It's on YouTube. There's been absolutely zero promotion, so only a few hundred people have seen it, and I haven't had time to do anything with it. But at this point, YouTube is over as a way to virally do anything.
Sure.
It's
too much noise.
It's over for now. I mean, really, this was true almost 3 years ago.
Sure.
And I know a couple of the top influencers in the world, and they said they could never do today what they did,
like to get established in the first
5 or
place.
6 years ago.
Yeah.
So it means you need to have a fair amount of money to launch things. So it's really just it's almost like, to me, a site to show your stuff. Now, if I were to keep at it long enough and be running around making relationships with other influencers, and I might be able to get up. But for me, I would rather just have enough episodes that I can go over to Netflix or Hulu, wherever it happens to be, or even Jeffrey Katzenberg's mobile-driven
his new jam
initiative. And so that's that. So I have, and then I've got scripts. So, but I had a job at the beginning of this year, and again, it was supposed to be like a year and a half in China, and it ended after 4 weeks. So right now I'm scrambling a little bit to find out what the next thing is going to be, because I need money and these DIY things.
Yeah.
If you do a DIY book or anything, you don't. It's 5,000 won't do it. 10,000. You're going to need 15 or 20 or $25,000 to have even a remote shot.
Yeah.
At breaking through in some way, and I can create art materials and videos and things much more easily than most people at a higher level than they would normally do for a YA book.
Sure.
But that only takes you so far. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I'm. I would like to see if I could get another gig in China with a studio. I have a friend who's got a studio there who's doing interesting work, and if he brings on another project, I would go over there. But I wouldn't do anything like a year and a half or a year. I would want it to be 6 months to a year, something like that.
Yeah, I obviously can relate to this really specifically, and part of why I created this show was to have a non-China focused podcast, because my other two are in that world. But because of this is the world I've been living in so much, and just coincidence of the merging of the worlds, even though 3 of my interviews from LA have been with people who have big China connections. So I've also, cross-posted them on the Big Fish in the Middle Kingdom show, because it's for China files, and yours, I will likewise, I will cross-post this on that other show, which is also a lot more established. So that'll help more people to hear the story. You mentioned this. I mean, you've had this incredible career, and, with the ups and downs and the sideways. And again, I get it. I relate to it directly and through all the people I know who've also built a career, because most careers, I mean, they aren't all as fortunate to have the highs, and some have even lower lows and everything in between. But this is a consistent thing for most people. How do you personally approach dealing with the challenges and adversity and the things? How do you keep on trucking and reframe and regroup and move forward? How are you wired to do this? Because you clearly, not taking no for an answer and have pulled your own string to move yourself forward. How do you approach these things?
Well, look, this is a business of disappointments, and the entertainment press, which is pervasive.
There's our pull quote.
Is all about, so-and-so got this deal, they got this deal. But if you really know anything and you dig below the surface, these things went on for years to get started. Celebrities don't come on and talk about really all the ups and downs, a little bit if they're challenged on it, because it's a good story here and there, but they don't talk about the week by week, month by month nonsense that goes, how many roles they try out for, all that's kind of invisible.
Exactly.
So that you be prepared. That's what the industry is about. And the way I have one solution always for this, which is to create. And the actual act of doing a script doing storyboards, creating marketing materials, even concept paintings. I lose myself and get excited in the thing. And that is a little bit about. Now, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem of, getting another gig going. Mm-hmm. But that has been my go-to place because think about it. I mean, the first big success I had was doing light shows because I literally pounded on a stage door and said, I want to learn this. And then I had something on SNL. Everybody told me not to do it, so I just did it anyway and brought it to them. But it was the thing I created. And, then I did the same thing with a book. And then I did the same thing. In 2000, I made a short called Protest, and it won awards all over the world. Mm-hmm. Probably the most awarded short of that year. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I do. I mean, right now, after this other gig just kind of disappeared underneath me. Well, of course, I'm out calling people and saying, "Hey, I'm available. Can we do this? What are you up to? What's happening?" I'll throw my hat in the ring for as a producer. Do you need anything done? And my circle of my network of friends and relationships. So I've already started. I've been doing that, and usually that can take anywhere because of the rate at which I get paid. Kind of what I do now. I can't kick back and I have to. Unfortunately, the number is pretty high because I've got a family to take care of, and a senior mom and all that jazz. So that becomes a consideration. But in the network, it could take 5, 6, 7 months to get another gig of a kind that really will pay me what I need. Right. So in the off hours, there's only so much you can do with the networking. On the off hours, I am creating things, and I always have a list of things I've got to get to. So I have right now I don't have I've been doing animation for so long, I need more live action, and I love writing for live action. Mm-hmm. So I have a couple of projects I'm going to push forward there. I have a TV show, and I may bring to a very well-known screenwriter, producer to see if he wants to go in on it with me. Mm-hmm. So it's that kind of, and that stuff is, you show your stuff a lot and you get turned down a lot, but it's a numbers game.
With the book, with the 25th anniversary edition of Shot by Shot, let's not be remiss and talk about that for a moment before we land the plane here. Yeah. What was your primary focus going into the updated edition of the book, and how do you feel about it having it out there in the world now?
Yeah. Well, for many, many years, I was kind of irritated by the fact that I had written about production technology that was digital. And even by 2000, which is now 19 years ago, at least half of that stuff or even more was obsolete. Right. And now it's not only is it obsolete, but many of the people who even use those kind of tools have never even heard of some of the things. Mm-hmm. They've been gone so long. So that was one thing we had to fix. And I also put up a website called shotbyshotbook.com. And it is open to the public, but it's just getting started. And that was a way to be able to do something that I could update, more frequently. And it'll have a lot of storyboards and stuff about gear. And not all that stuff is up there. The storyboard galleries of famous directors and storyboard artists and concept painters, that's beginning to be populated. Mm-hmm. And so going in, I felt that I wanted to, certainly update some of the storyboards. It's hard to imagine, but when I wrote the book, including Orson Welles and Citizen Kane and some of the classic movies, it was like, well, that's a no-brainer. Of course they're going to be in there. But today, some 25, 30 years later, the new generation, Orson Welles, I heard of him. It's just not the same thing. So even though I left a lot of that work in there because I felt it's important to do so, I did add new. So I have Deadpool, and I have some other newer things. Right.
So you really updated it for the new generation. Has the reception been nice?
Well, it's just out now, and it is a new version. It looks better because they had over the years. At one point, they lost the linotronic photography, which makes up 200-300 pictures in the book. Yeah. And so they were Xeroxes, or not Xerox, they were photocopies of the pages of the book.
I remember seeing an edition in the store that didn't look like the one that I had.
I went back and got all the photos, the actual photography, and scanned all of them in. And then it was also had the advantage of being able to do it in Photoshop, which I didn't have. There was no Photoshop when I did the book. So I did that, and then also I added gray tone to many, many of the illustrations. They were just line art, and I added gray tone panels in there to make them pop more and be better. And then I added some new material. And probably 4 of the chapters got almost completely rewritten, anything having to do with production technology.
Right.
The second edition has enough stuff to qualify or, be a value to get a new book. I still believe now at this point that the right way to do this has to be with video. And that's a major undertaking, and I'm not ready to do it. Someone else actually did do something I think called Hollywood cinematography, and it's expensive and a major work, but at the same time, the presentation I didn't think was that great in some ways, and so it should have been a home run. I think it did it okay, but it's still, someone could still do something. There's room to do that over. I mean, on the site is an opportunity to do that, but really, even as I put the site up and just try and get the storyboards up, the idea of going out on weekends and going to production companies and showing how car rigs work, or for, you're a boom guy, so I would have someone like yourself come out and we'd an hour, and then staging things. Well, I hope to do that someday, but it's not going to be 2019.
Right. Well, I was a boom guy 20 years ago. I've been a producer for 17 years, so you don't want me swinging the boom on your set. I'd probably whack everybody. What they always said: Have you hit a lot of people? Not lately. I might start now. Speaking of things that I'm probably no longer very good at, what is something that you wish that you were better at?
Well, storyboarding, painting, concept art. I was a kid who could draw in school, and so I could use those skills throughout my career in the analog days, let's say. And so I storyboard, thumbnailed, and that was just great. And I did marker comps. Marker was the preferred medium in many ways. And so if I could take a year and a half off and sort of get my painting and drawing chops better in the digital realm, I do use a Wacom tablet and I do all that, and that's how I create things. But, I need some time where I can just do that and only do that, because I have a number of different skills. And so I kind of miss the days when I could just do one thing for 3 months.
Exactly.
And 3 months wouldn't do it, but if I had a year to. So anyway, I would say my painting, drawing chops, which are pretty good. I know I have the ability to be a lot better. I just don't have time to improve.
What's the best?
And some people, those kind of skills, for example, I don't do them for months at a clip, and then suddenly I've got to do them nonstop for 2.5 or 3 weeks. And that just doesn't cut it. It's, I see other guys I know many, many, many board artists for obvious reasons, having done shot by shot, they all know me. And, I look at the words, damn, I could do that if I had like 4 months to
get up to speed, get your chops in order.
Yeah, I know. And 4 months, I guess it's kind of ridiculous. I need a year. I need a year to really just dig into digital painting and drawing. And it's not just merely digital. I would say the underlying drawing skills, there are things weaknesses I have that I would like to fix. And, at the end of the day, I can get a good painting out and get good storyboards out. And in fact, for storyboarding, there's many people who draw way more than is needed.
Mm-hmm. Right.
You're really just indicating shot flow, and you can get by with a relatively simple, as long as you can draw. And but at the same time, I'd say really concept art is kind of where I would put my energies.
Interesting. Stephen, last question for this round one. We'll have you back on here sometime and really just have a whole different show for people. For now, though, what's the best question about yourself that I didn't ask you?
Good Lord. Well, that's a very good
That's an
question.
open-ended way of saying, what would you like to say before we go?
Oh, okay. Well, let me think about this for a second. Well, you didn't really ask me about, what are my artistic goals, or why do I do this? What's the spiritual kind of underpinning for this
lay it
stuff.
on me. Lay it on me.
Okay, well, essentially, for me, my life's purpose, because I was married for a long time, but I didn't have kids, and that might have sort of overlapped with this. But my purpose was to challenge myself, and my brain and my whatever artistic skills I have, and how they relate to the world at large, and which is why I was very proud of my little short protest, because it was about the disappearance of the elephant and by implication, many other species. And I did in 2000. And now today it's so much worse than I ever could have imagined. Yeah. So much worse. And it's a tragedy, and it's a crisis, and doesn't get enough press. But anyway, to the extent that I could challenge myself and do something that was positive in the world, that was my interest. And positive in the world could have, I felt that, any of the great authors, whether it's The Great Gatsby or it's a more modern novel, these things are trying to be as honest and as probing on important things as possible. And I work more in commercial film nowadays, much of the time. And some of the stuff I write is pop fiction. And even though at the very bottom I want it to have some level of honesty, it's still escapism. Mm-hmm. So, and that's fine. There's a place for that. But at the same time, I could easily do political journalism or documentaries. That would be. I have things that I've written down. Okay, I could do this subject. So these are very specific things I could get to. But in a general sense, that's kind of what my life will add up to. And I haven't been able to do is anywhere near as much as I would like to do, or the way I would like to do it. But that's where my interest lies. So, and I would like to, the original Shot by Shot had 100 pages, which was really, technically speaking, about the neuroscience of vision and perception and how it relates to art. And that's probably my single biggest kind of interest I've had since I was sort of discovered it doing light shows. I did something in light shows that sort of opened up, and I didn't know at the time. I had a revelation which turned out to be kind of in parallel or not, or at the intersection. Well, it really was the key finding of neuroscience, in a very general sense, which is that we create the world around us. Mm-hmm. Rather, we're not just responding to it. What we're finding out is, of course, we invent half of this stuff.
Exactly.
And that, that's, putting it that way is covers a lot of holes, but that's kind of where we are. And I think it's going to be the new existentialism in another 10 or 15 or 20 years as we learn more and more about, because suddenly we're going to see things that we described in with adjectives and in sort of a philosophical way are now going to become, chemical formulas and algorithms of how the brain works. That not in the next decade, but 20, 30, 40, 50 years, that's really, I think, what's going to happen. So that's something I would like to find the time to be able to. So my next big book would be on that subject, would be at art and neuroscience.
Well, you just woke up a whole part of my brain, and we could do a show on that. I have a feeling that we could go on about this for quite a bit. This is right up my alley of interest as well, actually.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, and for me, it was, I was going to go to Columbia University I was 20 and I was going to do a workshop, or actually a presentation to the graduate school. And not as a student, as a, outside expert. Mm-hmm. And I was going to do, so we were going to do a piece I was going to do a demonstration on Brahms, I think it was the Third Symphony. And so I was doing some of the light show stuff and testing it out and building, out what I was going to do. And there's a light show effect, which is called Lumia. It's light, collimated light bounced off deformed mylar. Okay. And it produces these shapes that are really coming and going. It's almost like smoke. Mm-hmm. And as I was listening to it, the music, I kept realizing that I was syncing it up in my head, and suddenly, even though there was no obvious place for a beat or edges or anything, I would see I would look at this thing, I'd hear the music, and suddenly it would kind of, for a second or so, try and combine the two, or make one. And I realized, well, wait a second, there is no pattern there. that is really it. But the brain is trying to impose one, and I came to the conclusion the brain didn't like disorder.
Right.
And that was part of pattern recognition. Mm-hmm. And so I looked at that and I said, okay, that's really interesting. And so I sort of held that thought for some time before I encountered what is now modern neuroscience.
Steve, this has been fantastic. We got into so many things that I was completely unaware of, and I can't wait to talk to you again. Thank you for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad there's someone in China I have to talk to who can ask the right questions. And tell you, and I do want to know about your feature. So we'll wrap up, and then
we'll keep on talking.
Tell me.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, man.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, that is the show this week. Don't forget to visit crazyinagoodway.com for the links to show notes about this episode and to learn more about my other shows. I appreciate you listening. Please rate, share, subscribe, and review if you liked it. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next week.